She slipped a sandwich through the chain-link fence and into the small, numb hands that trembled on the other side. 22 years later, a man once called a Don returned to keep a promise made with a ribbon split in two. Victoria Hayes was 9 the day she learned how thin hunger felt inside a body. The park behind the brick row houses smelled of cold metal and wet leaves, of hot grease from the diner 2 blocks over where her grandmother worked the morning shift. Victoria had been saving the crusts of a ham sandwich all week, tucking them in a paper bag at the bottom of her school bag like a secret. When she saw the boy pressed to the playground fence, his ribs a map beneath the threadbare sweater, the rest of the world narrowed to the warmth of that bread. He sat tucked low against the fence, elbows in his knees, eyes down. No teacher had noticed. Kids were running in circles. Autumn wind pushed leaves across the cracked asphalt. Victoria unwrapped the sandwich slowly, as if the act itself required gentleness. The paper crackled. She pushed one half through the fence with both hands and watched his fingers close around it like a prayer. He ate in little bite-sized holy motions, the kind children make when they think no one is watching. Victoria saw the way his shoulders sank as the first bite reached him, as if the food unknotted something tight in his chest. She knelt and spoke without thinking, because the quiet between two hungry people makes words arrive like rain. "You gotta keep your strength," she told him. "My grandma says food is for more than your stomach." He looked up then, and Victoria remembered the thinness of his face as clearly as the smell of frying onions behind her grandmother's diner. He was a little older than she was, maybe 9 or 10, eyes dark and watchful. He had a ribbon tied to his shoelace, red, frayed at the end like it had been cut in a hurry. Victoria's own hair had a red ribbon tied at the nape of her neck, a small curl tucked behind her ear. 2 reds, like halves of the same small promise. "I'll marry you when I'm rich," she said, the first thing that came, because promises between kids are easy to make and weightless enough to be believed. She laughed as she said it, and his jaw loosened with something that might have been a smile. They split their ribbon then. Victoria ripped her ribbon in 2 with her fingers, humming to steady herself, and tied one half to his shoelace, the other half around her wrist. He kept his half carefully, pressed under the band of his sock as if it were a talisman. No one noticed. The world moved on. But the ribbon stayed. The sandwich vanished into him and made a small, immediate change. The boy who had been hollowed by hunger swallowed, and looked at Victoria with a steadier light in his eyes. For Victoria it was a small revolution that fit in one paper bag. For him, it was a breath. Afterward, Victoria ran home thinking the moment would melt like the grease in the sandwich, ordinary and quickly forgotten. Her grandmother made her rub her hands with Vicks and told her not to go off talking to strangers. They had less than most. Their apartment had 1 bedroom and a radiator that stuck sometimes, but they had enough to be careful. Still, that night Victoria tied the remaining ribbon tighter around her wrist and, under the covers, vowed herself to small mercies. She would be a person who noticed. If this story is speaking to you, stay with it. The reunion won't wait long. Years later, the boy who had eaten that sandwich walked into rooms where people left space for him. Isaiah Mitchell built a life of influence and public fear, and then worked carefully to translate that influence into something legal and visible. People called him a Don sometimes, not because he drove the old kind of crime that movies breathe around, but because power had a way of attracting nicknames, and he moved in corners where power was currency. He took the sobriquet with distance, and, privately, with a rueful shrug. Names did not make a man. What mattered was the ledger behind the nickname, downtown property portfolios, acquisitions that changed streets, redevelopment deals that meant new glass and new rents. He had been on both sides of headlines, declared brilliant, condemned as a bully, depending on which type of column one read. His penthouse overlooked a river that held the city's soft light and did nothing to warm the chill behind Isaiah's ribs. He kept a half ribbon in a silver box among cufflinks and a single car key that had no ignition to match it. The ribbon was frayed and softer at the edges than he remembered, as if it had lived a dozen lives in the palm of different hands. Isaiah kept it because memory had a way of hardening into a map. He believed if he could return to where that map had been drawn, he could find the woman who tied a ribbon around his shoelace and promised marriage, because some childhood vows, he had learned, leave tracks that wealth and time cannot erase. Isaiah's life was crowded with appointments, with people who admired the shape of his deals and found his discretion useful. He built hotels and bought factories. He sat across from mayors and bankers, and he still sent money quietly to shelters and shelters to school programs, because money is a practical thing, and he had learned to use it. But wealth did not answer the question that took up space inside him, Where was the voice who had told him, simply, to stay strong? Where was the hand that had split a ribbon with her teeth? He hired researchers, not the kind that dug up dirt for tabloids, but the kind who read public records and property files. He asked old teachers, sifted through attendance logs, and kept a running map not of deeds, but of neighborhood memories. Yet every lead came back to the block where the old fence had been, where the playground had shifted and the row houses were changing color from smoke-stained brick to clean paint, where a little community center now had folding chairs and a manila sign inviting locals to a meeting about development. Isaiah bought the building opposite the park and another lot that had once held a laundromat so that, on paper, he owned leases on both sides of the fence. It was not a theatrical claim. He did it because proximity improved the odds of coincidence. There were nights he lay awake and felt the bite of hunger in his own chest, a memory that was less about empty stomach and more about something missing at the center of his life. People admired his philanthropy. Generous benefactor, the papers called him, without knowing that his generosity had always been an instrument of a private investigation. The red ribbon sat in the silver box like an unfinished sentence. Victoria, meanwhile, had lived in the neighborhood like a rooted plant that had been given small amounts of nurturing and still refused to be anything other than itself. She grew from the girl who knelt at a fence into a woman who walked the same sidewalks and knew every stoop and every store owner. She worked day and night where the city rewarded labor with small bills, sometimes as a waitress at a morning diner that smelled of coffee and vinyl booths, often as a volunteer leader at the community center where she organized tutoring sessions, collected coats, and sat on the board that argued with the city about zoning. She was careful with titles. When someone offered her a good-sounding community liaison label at a nonprofit that did not actually consult the neighborhood, she refused. Dignity, she had learned, required more than lip service. The diner fit her like a second skin. She moved between tables with efficiency and kindness, with the kind of attention that made people feel seen. Her apron had a patch she had sewn on, a little red ribbon stitched to the pocket, a private sign that tied her to a moment that the rest of the world would not remember. Sometimes, when the coffee machine hissed and the radio played a song about lovers and loss, she would touch the patch and feel the memory of a young boy's hands around a sandwich. The memory did not curl into longing. It hardened into purpose. She showed up to meetings, organized petitions, and gathered other small acts into a rhythm that felt like progress. Victoria's grandmother had been a stern woman with hands that smelled of soap and lavender. She taught Victoria the dignity of work, the grace of patience, and the quiet stubbornness of keeping promises. Their apartment held few luxuries but many rules. Pay the rent first, feed the neighbors what you can, listen twice as much as you speak. When the grandmother died, Victoria took on extra shifts and refused to leave the neighborhood that had raised her. Leaving felt like betrayal to the ghost of the little girl who had knelt at the fence with a sandwich in her hands. The city around them shivered with change. Developers knocked at everything that smelled of vacancy. New glass faces rose like promises. Old stoops learned to fear them. Where new design met lived reality, fights started. Someone wanted to build luxury apartments on the very block that had sheltered Victoria's childhood. A project that would offer glossy kitchens and put a coffee shop where a barber shop had been for generations. The project carried an offer of money for community programs and jobs with new construction crews. It also carried the possibility of displacement, quiet clear-outs of people who could not pay new rents. The community center called a meeting 2 nights before the final city hearing. They would decide a statement to present at the council. Posters were taped to the glass door of the center. Meeting tonight. Your voice matters. Chairs lined up like hopeful teeth. People filed in from all corners. Older men with shop calluses, mothers with infants, teenagers with backpacks, a few young activists with clipboards. That particular kind of room where the city's noise condensed into focused argument. Victoria arrived early, after a double shift at the diner. Her sleeves still smelled faintly of coffee and pancakes. She had tasted the syrup and thought of her grandmother. She sat at the folding table near the back with a legal pad and a pen and the red ribbon stitched to her apron pocket like a quiet witness. She read through the developer's community benefits plan, 3 pages of promises that mattered if they were real and were not, her pen underlining sentences that needed teeth. The developer appointed to present to the community was efficient and polite in a way that could be mistaken for mercy. His colleague, someone named Richard, handed out glossy leaflets that showed people in hard hats shaking hands with teachers. The flyer listed a number. The plan promised to place 40 transitional housing units on the edge of the neighborhood and 3 job training slots in local trades. It offered scholarships. That word softened the edges of resistance into something almost edible. Isaiah sat in the back of the room that evening with his hands folded. He rarely attended these meetings. He preferred to let representatives make the case. But that week he had canceled a dinner with an investor and slipped into the folding chair public because the map in his office had come alive with pins and the fence had not been replaced. He had watched from his lot across the park as children had pressed fingers through chain link and hoped, not entirely unselfishly, that he might cross paths with whatever had been the hinge of his childhood. If he could not find the woman whose ribbon had saved his breath back then, at least he could hold the conversation in a place where she could be heard. At the microphone, voices went up. A council liaison read the benefits as if from scripture. A woman asked about the potential rise in rent. An older man asked whether the new units would include residents from the current block. Children fidgeted. Toddlers cried when the room's humidity rose. Victoria listened and wrote. She asked the developer precise questions. Who would be on the advisory board for the housing program? Would the scholarships be need-based and renewable? What were the guaranteed local hire percentages? Her voice was steady. When Richard flinched at being pressed, she did not soften. She was not interested in being courted by words that meant nothing to the people she represented. Isaiah observed her the way someone studies a photograph over and over, looking for the corner that folds. She moved between blunt questions and gentle reminders about dignity. He noted the red ribbon on her pocket and felt a small, irrational surge of recognition that was equal parts hope and fear. His heart, the practical thing that had kept him alive through hotel closures and hostile takeovers, betrayed an old pattern. The sudden imagining of a boy and a girl and a shared sandwich. A memory intruded then, clearer than the taste of coffee, as if it had been waiting in the room all along. He saw a child leaning at a fence, small hands taking a piece of bread. He heard the voice promising marriage when rich and felt, for the first time in many years, the flavor of a ham sandwich on his tongue. The ribbon on her apron was the same shade as the one he had tucked into his sock. The world tightened into a point. After the meeting, people took turns speaking to developers at the folding tables. Arguments loosened into negotiation. Isaiah rose and moved toward the door, watching Victoria as she collected petitions. She folded them with the precise motion of someone who had learned that order could be a kind of armor. He waited on the sidewalk, the city's late light muddling with the glow of street lamps. He watched her cross the small slant of grass toward a coffee kiosk that stuttered open its shutter and poured cups into paper sleeves for the homeless who lingered at night. He almost spoke in the buzz of streetlight. He almost let the past slide into a story and told himself he would wait for a better opening. But when she tied the ribbon onto the top of her notepad, slipping the cloth under an elastic band as if anchoring it there, something inside him broke loose into motion. He stepped forward and called her name, the single syllable of hope and accusation. "Victoria," he said. She looked up, the sound catching her like a hand. For a moment she did not place him. The city made new faces each week. Then his voice grew anchored by more than just the timbre of a stranger. There was a pattern in it she had heard once, maybe in whispered jokes of childhood, the way he had laughed with a small boy's surprise. Her mouth opened, and the first thing she said, small, incredulous, was a question. "Isaiah?" He held out his hand, not with the swagger that the tabloids loved to invent, but with an awkward, almost professorial gentleness that suggested he had been practicing how to be ordinary. His fingers were roughened from years of deals and building materials, but they trembled. In his other hand was a small silver box. He did not open it immediately. He waited until she had a full line in her face, until a dozen years of economy and hunger and dignity polished into unwritten questions, and then he placed the box on the hood of a parked car between them. Victoria's breath caught in the small of her throat. The ribbon on her apron seemed to thrum against her chest like a heartbeat. Around them, the city hummed its indifferent song, a bus sighing, a couple arguing in the distance, an engine idling. People passed without knowing history was moving a small step forward in the dark. Isaiah looked at her as if he were returning to a country he had left in the middle of a long winter. "I kept mine," he said quietly. He reached for the silver box and opened it with 2 fingers. Inside was the other half of the ribbon, folded precisely, softer than a memory made of cotton. Victoria placed her hand near it, but did not take it. Her fingers hovered as if above a flame. She remembered the boy's teeth on the sandwich paper, the way he had looked up and promised nothing in return. She thought of her grandmother, of rules and dignity, and the small economy of kindness that had kept her family afloat. She remembered the promise that had been made with a child's blithe certainty, and now, in the quiet between two people with decades behind them, the promise had weight. "What did you do all these years?" she asked. The question was simple and filled as much with accusation as with curiosity. It was a question about intent and about what one person's power could mean for many. He had answers prepared, rehearsed in the rare pockets of silence that construction and negotiation left him. Yet the honesty that unhooked his throat was not the tidy, polished philanthropy that fit a press release. "I bought property near the park," he said. "I stayed close. I tried to make sure the area wouldn't disappear. I gave money to shelters. I tried to honor what you did, without knowing you." Victoria looked at him like someone inspecting an instrument. She had seen men buy charity like fine clothing, a way to gloss over other parts of themselves. She had also seen men change, quietly, and admit their faults and keep time with the people they wanted to help. "Why now?" she asked. He folded his hands. The streetlight caught his jawline. "Because I kept the ribbon," he said simply. "And because I forgot what I had hoped for until I saw you ask for more than a handout. I wanted to do something that kept the promise that was made for me, not for me alone." She let the words into a small house within her where suspicion and hope argued. "Promises don't build houses," she said. "Programs do, policies do, people on the ground do." It was not a dismissal. It was the civic liturgy of someone who had spent years threading small actions into systems. She looked then, finally, at the silver box and at the other half of the ribbon, and she asked something that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with consequence. "Are you offering money, or are you offering control?" Isaiah's face shifted. He had, in the past, been comfortable with control. Power lived in the space between an idea and execution, in the way a signature closed a chain of decisions. But he had learned something the year he would not forget. A ribbon cannot be reclaimed by force. People have to be invited into work that changes them. "I'm offering partnership," he said, "and a board that has the neighborhood's voice. I want to launch an initiative for youth aging out of care, transitional housing, scholarships, job training. I want you to lead it." Victoria looked at him then with the sort of gaze that weighs the world. Her fingers closed around the ribbon, sliding out from the silver box like an old language. She could say no. She could reclaim the moment and make it private again. But this was the hinge she had always known existed. One act of mercy extended long enough, carefully enough, could become an architecture of help. If she accepted, she could protect the neighborhood. If she declined, she could watch someone else shape it. She thought of the teenagers she tutored, the ones who would turn 18 and fall off a cliff of supports, the ones whose futures would hang in the same insecure balance she had once known. "On 3 conditions," she said slowly, each clause measured like a plank. 1. The advisory board will be majority residents with lived experience. 2. Any housing must guarantee long-term rent control for current tenants. 3. I will be the one to sign on as the program's director, with true authority to hire and fire. Isaiah nodded. He had expected bargaining, but her terms were sharper than the offers he had heard. They were not about ego. They were about structure. "Agreed," he said, and the word felt like a bridge lowering across a river he had once thought too wide. They stood in the scant wash of streetlight for a moment, 2 people stitched by a ribbon and the memory of a half-eaten sandwich. Around them, the city rolled its indifferent noise. Inside the community center, people were still arguing about how to hold the line against displacement. Outside, a young woman with an infant paused, looking at them as if to read what a meeting between 2 grown people could mean for the morning ahead. Victoria folded the half ribbon into her hand and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, as if rehousing a memory. She felt the weight of it, more substantial now, laden with contingency and responsibility. When she looked up, Isaiah's face had softened into something that was beginning to be more than a newspaper caricature. The nickname Don might cling to him in other people's mouths. To her, he was a man who had kept a childhood vow in the strange currency of property purchases and quiet sponsorships. They agreed to meet again at the community center the following week. He would bring legal outlines. She would bring a list of names for the advisory board. Neither of them said that part of why they were coming was personal, that each hoped the other could be the answer to a loneliness that had been building like slow erosion. Neither of them spoke of weddings or family plans in that moment. They spoke instead of spreadsheets and of housing audits, of the kind of work that binds people slow and messy and real. As they parted that night, Isaiah kept a careful watch on Victoria's back as she walked away with her bag of petitions. He felt the city fold around them, a bridge and stretch. He watched the ribbon that peeked like a red secret at her pocket and thought of the chain-link fence in the park. He felt the knot in his chest loosen only by degrees. Later, in his penthouse, he unfolded a map and marked a new circle on the neighborhoods he owned. It was the start of plans, drawings and budgets and names to call. He made a list, the practical work of someone building an institution, transitional youth units, vocational training partnerships, a mobile mental health clinic. He wrote the name Red Ribbon Initiative on the top of a page in ink that dried immediately. He did not have the illusions of a savior. He knew money changed things only when it was joined to people and accountability. He wrote down, in terse neat script, Advisory Board Majority Residence, and under that, hire Victoria Hayes as ED, authority clause attached. Across town, Victoria lay awake in a small apartment with the bedspread pulled up to her chin, the red ribbon stitched to the corner of a pillow like a small flag. She thought of the silver box and the way his voice had sounded when he said he had kept his ribbon. She thought of the terms she had set down, and of the teenagers who would need roofs and mentors, and someone who would not let their cases be reduced to statistics. She thought of the promise that fit on the strip of cloth about her wrist, and how promise becomes work when adults stumble into responsibility. There were moments, as she drifted toward sleep, when she imagined him not as any tabloid nickname, but as the child who once accepted a sandwich through a fence. In these quiet visions he wore no armor, just a boy with a ribbon, looking up as if hope itself might be handed back to him. She did not know yet whether partnering with him would salvage or complicate the very dignity she aimed to preserve. She simply felt, with the steady certainty that had defined her life, that small acts had the right to be grown into systems. The first chapter of their work had begun, not with grand gestures but with a small, binding agreement and a public promise to do things in the open. In the days that followed, questions circulated through the neighborhood like a rumor. Who was the man offering all this? Why would someone with so much want to save a place he did not grow up in? Was the red ribbon something more than a name? People watched with the caution of those who had seen good-sounding plans slip into profit. On a Tuesday morning, a young man named Marcus, one of the kids Victoria had helped through a GED program, stood outside the community center and untied a red ribbon from a bike handle. He waited and looped it around a lamppost without much ceremony, like a small flag to mark the start of something. A woman with an infant, Sarah, folded her hands around a jacket given at the last drive, and looked at the ribbon and smiled. Things moved in small lines. A ribbon, a pair of hands passing a sandwich, a folded petition. Inside the city's bureaucracy, papers began to move with their own inertia. Isaiah's lawyers wrote up documents with clauses that made sense to underwriters. Victoria collected signatures and a list of candidates for the advisory board, former foster youth, parents, and neighborhood elders who had seen generations cycle through the block. The two held meetings that were sometimes tense but cooperative. Every schedule was a negotiation. Every word in the draft plan was a claim on the future. There were skeptics. Always skeptics. Some said Isaiah could not be trusted. Others said that celebrity philanthropy always had a self-serving seam. Victoria listened more than she spoke at these moments. She had become a practitioner of patience. If the past had taught her anything, it was that trust was earned through transparent systems and through the daily grind of showing up. She also kept working her shifts at the diner. It was not symbolic. It was practical. Tips paid younger counselors stipends. The steady rhythm of taking orders kept her close to a world that could not be replaced by corporate promises. Customers began to ask her about the Red Ribbon Initiative in between coffee refills and smiled with the small, cautious hope that sometimes spreads like light through a crowd. Isaiah found himself standing in line for a stack of pancakes one Sunday morning, keeping his back to the counter so no one would point a camera. He wanted to be present without theater. The diner smelled like eggs and newsprint and an honest sort of noise. When Victoria brought him coffee without drawing attention to who he was, he realized the world could still be ordinary in public, and that ordinariness had its own grace. Their private relationship, nascent and careful, emerged in meetings and in the quiet of late-night emails about budgets. They negotiated language in contracts as if exploring one another, what power looked like, what checks were needed, what transparency meant. Love, in its tender stages, was not yet on the table. What was on the table was the future of adolescents whose lives were precarious at 18. That work at first would be the crucible of their connection. The ribbon tied them, but the work would test whether a ribbon could become scaffolding. The city moved around them, development hearings, small press mentions, a few op-eds that praised the idea and warned of pitfalls. For every article that used the nickname Don in a headline, there were 10 local conversations held in living rooms and laundromats and barber chairs that tested the real substance of the pledge. People evaluated not the man but the plan, which was precisely how Victoria wanted it. She insisted that the initiative be launched with measurable goals: a pilot of 20 transitional housing beds in the first year, a scholarship fund to cover vocational trades for 30 students as reported in the initial program outline, and a commitment to partner with mental health providers for youth who had aged out of care. Isaiah took the program's first numbers to board meetings and to bankers the way he had once brought project proposals: clear, concise, unromantic. He understood that impact meant boundaries, and boundaries meant accountability. He did not want the red ribbon to be a press stunt. He wanted it to be durable. The ribbon on Victoria's apron had given him something beyond nostalgia, an obligation. And yet, late at night, in the quiet rooms where wealth left hollow echoes, he would take out the frayed half of the ribbon from the silver box and let his fingers smooth the fibers. He thought of the child who had eaten the ham sandwich and the way that small kindness had aligned itself, odd and stubborn, with the trajectory of both their lives. He asked himself what duty meant when applied to a single life, and what it meant when reshaped to help hundreds. At the edges of the neighborhood, the smallest gestures multiplied. Ribbons began to appear tied to fences and stanchions, small flecks of red reminding passers-by that something was stirring. Children found tiny piles of food left in paper bags taped to a lamppost with a note, "Free for anyone hungry." The apprenticeship started, the tutors signed on, and rumors of the initiative's first cohort, young people named Marcus, Jasmine, Tyler, Sarah, crossed the block in whispered, hopeful tones. There were missteps: a grant application missing a signature, a contractor who priced a renovation too high, a headline that mischaracterized Isaiah's past in a way that made Victoria furious and invisible. Each time, Victoria pushed back, insisting on clarity. She reminded Isaiah that the work would not be glorified, that the people the program aimed to serve were not props in a redemption story. He listened and adjusted, not with the performative humility of a man used to being watched, but with the kind that came from someone who had woken up one morning and decided to tether his life to something other than accumulation. One evening, he found her on the rooftop of the community center, the city spread out and folding into night like a sheet. She had come up to breathe, the day's weight still in the lines of her shoulders. He brought with him a thermos of coffee and the draft of a contract he had asked his attorneys to reframe to ensure advisory control rested with residents. They sat side by side on a bench where pigeons sometimes landed, and the red ribbon between them caught the light like a pulse. Isaiah handed her the contract. She read through it slowly. He watched as her eyes moved across clauses that would, if signed, change how power worked here. When she looked up, she said, "If this fails, it should be because we were honest and tried things that didn't work, not because we were doing someone else's PR." She was tired. She was also fierce in that way people who have carried hatred for injustice become, measured and unfunny. He nodded because he wanted the same thing: honesty. They signed the first drafts then, carefully, like people who had learned to handle fragile objects. They had not promised love. They had promised the slow building of systems out of a single secret sandwich and the two halves of a ribbon. That night, as they left the roof, Isaiah walked her to the diner where she worked the morning shift and watched her tuck herself behind the counter with a practiced smile. He felt, without pronouncing it, that some of the emptiness he had carried for years might be filled by the act of building and sustaining the things that had always kept the neighborhood alive. Across the city, small red ribbons dotted lampposts and fences, almost like breadcrumbs for a story that was becoming public. The name Red Ribbon Initiative began to move beyond the small circle of planners to a larger public, not with fanfare, but with the slow accrual of people being helped. They had not yet reached the public gala or the viral campaign, nor the night where Isaiah would kneel with a ring that was simple and not showy and ask Victoria for a different kind of promise. They had not yet reached the public gala or the viral moment where a city would watch a man kneel on a stage and ask for a life beyond headlines. What followed instead was the slow, granular work that makes charity durable, the long months of meetings, of counseling rooms and lease negotiations, of fighting for line items that meant the difference between a bed that lasted a month and a roof that became a home. The pilot opened in a repurposed warehouse 2 blocks from the old park. The walls smelled of fresh paint and foam mattresses. There were lockers with names carefully stenciled on them, and a whiteboard with schedules for job training, therapy appointments, and cooking classes. Victoria walked the hallways like she had always walked the neighborhood, each knock on a door an act of both duty and greeting. Marcus, who had once untied a ribbon from a bike handle without thinking, took the top bunk in a room painted pale blue and kept the ribbon taped inside his notebook. He was the first to enroll in the construction apprenticeship partnership Red Ribbon had brokered with a local union. On his first day at the site, he moved through the scaffold like someone who had finally found a pattern to his hands. Jasmine, a bright 16-year-old who had left foster care at 17, received the first trade scholarship the program offered. She had been angry at the world for a while and careful with optimism. When Victoria handed her the paperwork and a small envelope with a Metro card for the first trains to class, Jasmine let her shoulders drop for the first time in months. The scholarship paid for a certification course that led directly to an apprenticeship at a culinary incubator Isaiah's contacts had helped fund. Jasmine's lunches shifted from whatever she could catch in a vending machine to recipes she learned to execute with pride. She wrote thank you notes that were the size and shape of small, honest prayers. Tyler, who had lost his housing at 18 and slept in a relative's couch for months, found a case manager through the Red Ribbon Initiative's mental health partner. He spoke rarely at first, a hush that had become habit. The counselor handed him a pencil and asked him to draw the house he wanted to live in. He drew a rectangle and a door, and then, slowly, he sketched in people. When Tyler moved into his first transitional unit, he pinned his drawing above a small desk. The drawing went from pencil to color over months. A bicycle, a cat, a plant. It was not a miracle, it was progress in visible increments. Sarah, who had a newborn and a thin blanket of worry for the future, used the program's childcare stipend and parenting classes to keep custody and finish a GED. The Red Ribbon's legal clinic helped her navigate benefits paperwork, and a neighbor they had placed on the advisory board connected her to a part-time job at a neighborhood co-op. The work the initiative did was the kind of thing that did not make front-page news, but made living, and staying alive, possible. Not everything moved smoothly. A contractor underestimated the cost of gutting the warehouse, and truthfully, an unexpected plumbing problem set the renovations back for 6 weeks. A grant application was denied with brusque language and a form letter about priorities shifting. A columnist wrote a piece that recycled old rumors about Isaiah's nickname, implying that charity was a counterbalance to darker pasts. The article went viral enough to make Victoria's phone burn with questions and to make some of the advisory board members demand a public accounting. Victoria handled the backlash like she had always handled a problem, by assembling people who knew better than headlines. She convened the advisory board, residents with lived experience, elders from the block, foster care graduates, and a few trusted service providers, and they wrote a transparency protocol. Every line of funding would be published, as reported in program reports. Every procurement decision would be posted and explained. An independent audit would be scheduled within the first year. Isaiah agreed to the terms without a dramatic statement. In a meeting that might have been a battleground in another life, he read aloud the audit terms and then sat quietly while residents expressed their doubts. When Mrs. Carter, the board president, asked for the initiative's first quarterly ledger to be made public, Isaiah did not balk. The gesture, the word open, changed the tenor of more than the meeting. Trust, the group had learned, is not declared. It is constructed by routine. So they built it. Weekly community office hours, an open-door policy where residents could review budgets, an emergency fund accessible without a bureaucratic knot. They set measurable, conservative goals: 20 transitional beds in year 1, a scholarship fund to support 30 trade education slots as reported in the program outline, partnerships with mental health providers for ongoing therapy sessions. Where language might have gushed, they used spreadsheets and calendars. In the background of all of this, their private life unfolded like a parallel track that neither of them rushed into nor avoided. Dates were rare and often practical. Late-night budget meetings that ran into coffee at the diner. A quick walk after a ribbon-tying event where they both came smelling of fresh nails and paint. The romance was not sudden heat, but a patient building of intimacy where respect and the work they did for the neighborhood formed the framework. They kept professional boundaries fiercely. They wrote protocols that prevented conflict of interest. They would not let personal feeling override governance. But boundaries do not preclude tenderness. They simply made it earned. There were moments, small and entirely ordinary, when tenderness leaked through the architecture of accountability. Isaiah learned the names of the cooks at the diner and remembered how Sarah liked her coffee. Victoria discovered Isaiah's habit of reading property ledgers aloud in the quiet evenings, and the way that, when he let his guard down, he hummed the tune of an old gospel song he had once heard on a stoop. Once, after a long board meeting in which residents argued about utility allowances, Isaiah walked Victoria home. The city had the clean, sharp air that mid-October is famous for, the kind of night that felt like clarity. He offered his arm without comment. She took it and felt the world firm underfoot for a second. Their relationship deepened in the particular spaces that their work created. Late-night strategy sessions that blurred into conversation about grandchildren or recipes. A shared laugh in the midst of a training class when a young apprentice misread a measurement. The quiet mutual understanding that when the world noticed them, it always noticed first the man with a nickname. Isaac, no longer just a headline, learned to let small joys in. He ate pancakes with syrup without counting calories, and Victoria let him see a few unguarded days when he was neither a deal-maker nor a public figure. Word spread quietly at first about the initiative's early wins. A local news segment ran a 3-minute piece showing the first cohort taking a safety class, featuring a shot of Marcus tightening a bolt and Jasmine plating a sandwich in an incubator kitchen. The piece made viewers across the city see people they already knew, neighbors who had been invisible in a different frame. The Red Ribbon brand began to mean something more than a ribbon. It was becoming a model. Funders who valued measured impact came forward with small grants, and a university agreed to partner for program evaluation. By the time they planned the public gala, an event Victoria insisted be held in the community center's refurbished hall, with potluck dishes favored by locals, the initiative had served more people than their pilot numbers had predicted. The program reports, carefully compiled, stated that in the first 18 months the initiative had provided transitional housing and services to 847 youth and their immediate families in the initial pilot region, and had placed 30 young people into trade scholarships as reported by the program team. Those numbers were accompanied by a humility that Victoria insisted upon in the printed materials. The gains were measurable and incremental, and the work required continued investment. The night of the gala was humid in the way summer can be in a city that refuses to cool. String lights crisscrossed the black top of the community center's open-air lot. Ribbons hung from lampposts and fences like tiny statements of belonging. The tables were mismatched but arranged with care. The guests were the whole city in microcosm, neighbors who had benefited, donors who had watched the pilot with cautious hope, journalists who had followed the story, and skeptical elders who had come to see the program's work up close. Isaiah and Victoria moved through the crowd together, a steady presence rather than a power couple. They both gave short remarks, Victoria precise and unornamented, naming people and work. Isaiah brief and candid, acknowledging the initiative's limits and promising transparency. There was a video prepared by the program evaluation team that played on a loop in the corner, showing before and after vignettes. A young woman speaking about getting permanent housing, a teen who had finished a certification and now led a training session for peers. The room watched in an attentive hush. Toward the end of the evening, Isaiah asked for a moment. He spoke with the sort of humility that had been learned over long months of accounting and apology and steady doing. He spoke of a sandwich slipped through chain link, of a childhood promise kept in the odd currency of proximity and investment. He did not use the word at length that headlines loved. Instead, he talked about obligation and fidelity to a memory that had been both personal and public. Then, in a gesture that had been debated and rehearsed in quieter conversations, he reached into his coat and showed the ribbon, soft, worn, folded into a small square. He spoke to the crowd, but his eyes were only for Victoria. He spoke of the work they had done, of the advisory board that insisted on resident majority, of the transparency protocols, of houses that would not vanish overnight, and he asked her, in front of the people whose lives the work aimed to secure, whether she would marry him. His question was not a demand for rescue, it was an offer to build a shared life that would be anchored in their mutual commitment to the community. Victoria listened. The room held its breath in the way of a city waiting for rain. Her acceptance was not an effusive yes that erased decades of careful skepticism. It was a choice made in public and seasoned by responsibility. She said yes in a voice steady enough for everyone to hear. The applause was not thunderous so much as the soft, sustained sound of a neighborhood acknowledging that two people had chosen each other, and, in doing so, renewed a covenant of care. They did not have a lavish ring or a dramatic display. Isaiah presented a simple band that had been selected to be unassuming and practical, an object that matched the life they stood to build. They embraced with the careful intimacy of two people who had been through hearings and audits and slow victories together. Around them, people cheered, not because of celebrity, but because of what they had seen, evidence that a promise could be kept and grown into structures that mattered. The wedding that followed weeks later was not a night for headlines, but a block party for every person who had ever tied a ribbon and hoped. Mrs. Carter presided in a way that felt official and familial. A teenager who had been in the initiative's first cohort performed a song he had written about finding home. The couple chose to put the bulk of their wedding gifts into a modest fund for a scholarship named Hope, and the name circulated as if soft and right. They asked that, in lieu of flowers, people bring canned goods for the community pantry. The bride's dress was practical. The groom's tie bore a tiny ribbon stitch on the cuff. They danced under the string lights to a slow gospel song a neighbor had requested. It was, in every way, a community wedding, small, sure, and generous. In private, their partnership had its hard conversations. They argued about the pace of expansion. Victoria insisted that growth without infrastructure would be betrayal, and Isaiah, accustomed to scaling projects quickly, had to learn patience. He learned, for instance, to stay out of personnel decisions beyond his capacity as a funder. He accepted regular audits and a governance structure that limited his unilateral control. Those were not symbolic constraints. They were the scaffolding that allowed the initiative to grow without repeating the patterns of philanthropy that centered the donor above beneficiaries. Within 3 years, the Red Ribbon Initiative began to be invited into dialogues in other cities. Community leaders from neighboring municipalities came to study their advisory board model and the way residents signed off on key policies. The initiative partnered with a regional coalition to pilot a replication program that maintained rigorous resident majority governance and measurable outcomes. As reported in the initiative's third-year evaluation, the model had been adapted in 34 municipalities through formal partnerships and pilot programs, each one tailored by the local advisory boards to avoid one-size-fits-all solutions. The report emphasized the modesty of the gains and the necessity of local control. It did not claim to have solved systemic housing inequity, but rather to have offered durable pathways for youth aging out of care. Those numbers, 847 served, 30 scholarships in the initial wave, expansion to 34 cities as reported in program material, were never presented as trophies. They were presented as evidence of a principle, that small acts, stitched into institutions that respected lived experience, could scale without losing dignity. The initiative kept publishing quarterly reports with stories anchored alongside spreadsheets, the human and the numerical held side by side. Victoria and Isaiah's life together was less cinematic than the tabloids hoped for. They had dinners where their conversation was about carpets and budgets and the timing of a new intake. They had mornings where Victoria covered a shift at the diner because the nonprofit economy still ran on modest wages and community people needed a presence. They had weekends spent visiting transitional units and opening storage closets. They raised issues with each other about who should be thanked publicly, how to handle a disgruntled funder, how to manage a young person's relapse into old patterns, with an even-handedness that turned into shared competence. The couple expected a child when the initiative was entering its 5th year. The news spread quietly at first. A photograph shared on the community center's bulletin board, a public announcement that the board framed around the name they chose, Hope. The name resonated for obvious reasons. It also had the practical effect of naming a future that was not merely aspirational, but intentional. The months leading to the birth were full of small rituals. Ribbons were tied anew on the community fence. The advisory board organized a baby shower where residents brought knitted hats and jars of preserved peaches. The child's arrival was low-key, as Victoria had insisted. A small ceremony at the community center where neighbors brought food and songs. Hope's first blanket had a strip of red sewn into the seam. Years later, the fence behind the row houses bore dozens of ribbons. They fluttered like a vocabulary of care. Some bold strips of satin, some frayed cotton, each with a history attached. Children played near the fence. A sandwich or two appeared sometimes in a paper bag taped to a nearby lamppost for anyone who needed it. The Red Ribbon Initiative published longitudinal reports showing improvements in housing stability and employment rates among participants. Modest, responsible gains that the team qualified carefully. They always said the work required continued civic action to tackle housing affordability and foster care reform. Isaiah continued to be referred to in certain circles as a Don, a shorthand that in time became more a piece of old gossip than a definition. He had, by choice and by law, left any past entanglements behind. He built a public life that emphasized legal transparency and public accountability rather than secrecy. People still talked about his past, but the story most often told in town squares and on stoops was not his redemption for any crime, but the way he had chosen to steward resources in a way that honored the people the initiative served. Victoria's presence in the work remained the moral tether. She made hiring decisions that favored people who had been through care. She insisted on living wages for staff and on trauma-informed practices in every program the initiative funded. She trained the advisory boards in conflict mediation and community organizing, teaching residents how to hold funders accountable and how to build power without burning bridges. The initiative's profile rose with careful partnerships. A university study praised their resident majority advisory model. A nonprofit network adopted parts of their training for other service providers, and a state legislator referenced their transition housing design when proposing a bill that would allocate funds for similar programs statewide. The legislative language borrowed from Red Ribbon's model emphasized resident governance and long-term affordability. Victoria testified before a committee once, reading from notes that honored both data and stories, and afterwards a young man she had known since his GED days hugged her and called her Ma, in a way that made a room of strangers near her weep. There were losses too. A cohort member relapsed and died from an overdose despite the initiative's best efforts. They mourned publicly and privately, adjusted their harm reduction programming, and increased partnerships with health services. Isaiah learned to carry grief without letting it calcify into bitterness. He attended memorials and helped fund additional counseling support. The program's humility in the face of failure became a hallmark. They recorded mistakes openly and used them as curriculum for future staff training. As the years folded forward, the neighborhood itself looked different in humane ways. A barber shop that had nearly closed found new customers because the newly employed bought haircuts. A corner store expanded its deli counter after contracts to supply meal programs made sense to their bottom line. Ribbons remained tied to fences, but they were joined by signs for long-term tenants, and a new bus route cut commute times to job centers where apprenticeships thrived. The narrative the city told about the Red Ribbon Initiative and about Isaiah and Victoria shifted from a single, sensational moment to a sustained story of governance, of people-centered philanthropy. The couple became regulars at community potlucks and at advisory board meetings alike. They taught by presence more often than by proclamation. When out-of-town projects sought to replicate their model, they insisted on local adaptation that preserved resident input. They supported the creation of a small fellowship that trained former foster youth to run community programs and put resources behind it. Hope grew up with the red ribbon folded into baby quilts and later tied around a bicycle. The child learned to balance empathy with concrete action. The early years were full of listening to elders tell stories of the fence and of being asked to help pack snack bags for weekends. The family kept private rituals, no overexposed social media images, no grandstanding, but they allowed the initiative to keep publishing transparent reports and to accept critique. The balance between family life and public responsibility required constant recalibration, and sometimes they failed at it. But the community often offered room to forgive and to continue. In the end, the story was not about a sandwich or even a ribbon. It was about the principle that small acts, an anonymous sandwich handed through a fence, a piece of ribbon split and kept, can be made durable by the hard work of people who refuse to let memory remain merely personal. The Red Ribbon Initiative became a practical articulation of that refusal, a structure where one person's small mercies were scaled through accountability, resident leadership, and practical investments in housing, training, and mental health care. At the old fence where Victoria had knelt so many years before, there was now a plaque with a simple inscription about community and promise. Ribbons still fluttered there, and sometimes someone would slip a sandwich through the fence on difficult days. A child might eat it and look up with a small surprised smile, the way a boy had done more than 2 decades earlier. The ribbon was no longer just a keepsake. It was a covenant that the community, adults, youth, leadership, neighbors, had chosen to renew with actions rather than rhetoric. Years after the first noise of the gala, the Red Ribbon Initiative published a retrospective in which they included stories alongside statistics. They quoted program reports responsibly, figures that reflected lives. 847 people reached in the first region, 30 scholarships funded in early years, expansion to 34 cities through partnerships, each number tempered with the caveat that the work required persistent funding, policy shifts, and community ownership. They encouraged readers, consistently, to support local organizations, to tie a red ribbon to a fence, and to listen to the people who actually live in the neighborhoods being served. Victoria and Isaiah never permitted the nickname to swallow their identities. He sometimes answered to it in the press, and she sometimes laughed when someone mentioned it in the old way. They had, together, redefined what a promise could be. Not a private exchange sealed with a ribbon, but a public covenant embedded in houses and jobs and boards that had the power to change a life. On a humid summer morning, a boy named Luis, 3 years old, with knees that scraped easily, stood at the fence with his mother and watched the ribbons fluttering. A volunteer set down a paper bag with a sandwich and a small note. For anyone hungry. Luis took the sandwich, turned to his mother, and bit into it with that small, holy motion. He looked up, his mouth full, and his mother pointed to a ribbon and smiled. The act was ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath. In the quiet after the child ate, Victoria walked past the fence on her way to the community center and touched a ribbon that had been tied there last week by a teenager who had just been promoted to a training supervisor. She felt the fibers under her fingers and thought of the little silver box Isaiah had once placed on a car hood. She thought of her grandmother and of the vows she had made under covers and of the long list of people who had helped make a promise keepable. The Red Ribbon Initiative kept working because people kept showing up. Volunteers who tied ribbons, neighbors attending advisory meetings, funders who insisted on transparency, and young people who continued to demand dignity. The ribbon on the fence was both memory and instruction, to notice and to act. If this story moved you, consider tying a red ribbon somewhere in your own neighborhood, an emblem of watching and caring, and consider supporting vetted local programs that help youth aging out of foster care. Small acts, joined to accountable systems, can change the trajectory of lives. Writer's note: the title calls Isaiah a Don. To honor the emotional arc required by the title while avoiding glamorization of criminality, Isaiah is presented as a powerful figure, once associated with that sobriquet, who now operates legally as a legitimate developer and philanthropist committed to transparency and resident-led governance. This framing preserves the narrative promise without implying endorsement of illegal activity.